One border, no bosses, all workers. What do I mean by this? Well, I'm going to read for you an essay that I wrote, and it's basically calling for the need for a worldwide movement of labor unions. And so, the title of my essay, which is at my Substack 7 Commandments, is Workers of the World Are Fragmented, Why We Need a Truly Global Labor Movement Again. My essay that I'm presenting to you is grounded in the work of Martha Rudolph Rocco, the great anarcho-syndicalist. And so let us begin. I hope you enjoy this, even if you don't agree with the conclusions that I am presenting. So, the present age carries itself like a body ill at ease within its own skin, a restless creature whose nerves twitch where labour capital and the state rub against one another like bones badly set. Industry has swollen like an overfed liver. Nations chatter to one another with the quick saliva of commerce, and wealth has thickened in the bloodstream until it clots in a few marrow arteries, and starving the limbs. Ad hoc translation for this. Thus, the working classes of all lands find themselves bound as if by sinew through their skins, though their skins, are marked off by the artificial scars of frontier, language, and custom. In such a condition, it is no longer enough that labour organise itself within the cramped rib cage of the nation. The need for a global movement of labour unions stands before us like a pulse that will not be stilled, at once a practical demand and a moral imperative. Martha Rocco once said, quote, "The organisation of labour is the living expression of its will to freedom." End of quote. In this regard, the thought of Martha Rudolph Rocco offers not merely guidance, but the very skeleton upon which such a body may be built. Martha Rudolph Rocco, whose reflections upon anarchism and syndicalism sprang from a deep sympathy with the struggles of working people, looked upon the world with the clear eye of a surgeon who knows where the wound lies. Ex nihilo, translation out of nothing. He perceived that the emancipation of labour could not be achieved through political institutions alone. No more than a diseased organ may be cured by painting the skin above it. He rejected the notion that the state, even when clothed in democratic garments, could serve as the instrument of genuine liberation. For him, the state was bound up with authority, hierarchy, and coercion. As the spine is bound to the body, rigid, commanding, unwilling to bend without pain, it stood not as a neutral arbiter, but as an apparatus through which the dominant classes kept their grip like a fist clenched around the throat. Sort of reminds me of the joke about Chuck Norris, the Family Guy joke. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it, but it's basically that Chuck Norris was so tough that he, under his beard, is not a chin, it's another fist. So, for him, so he perceived the emancipation of labour, and we've already read that, so he rejected the notion of the state. Garments could serve as the instrument of genuine liberation. For him, the state was bound up with authority, hierarchy, and coercion, as the spine is bound to the body. Rigid, commanding, unwilling to bend without pain, it stood not as a neutral arbiter, but as an apparatus through which dominant classes kept their grip, like a fist clenched around. I already read that. And so, Martha Rocco once said, quote, "Power operates destructively, bent always on forcing every manifestation of life into the straitjacket of its laws. End of quote. To seek freedom through such machinery was, in his estimation, to mistake the very nature of power as if one expected blood to flow freely through a vein already tied off. Quid pro quo. Translation. Something for something. Instead, Matua Rudolf Rocker placed his faith in the capacity of workers to organize themselves through voluntary associations, most especially labor unions. These unions, when stirred by solidarity and mutual aid, become living organs, beating hearts within the broader body of society. They are not mere defensive tissues concerned only with wages or hours, like skin that reacts to a cut. They are embryos, small yet potent, containing within them the full design of a future society in which production and distribution are directed by those whose hands perform the labor. Matua Rocker once said, quote, "The union is not only a means of struggle, but a school for the future." Isn't that a beautiful quote? The union is not only a means of struggle, but a school for the future. That is almost sort of poetic in his sort of a view, sort of, when you think about it, it sort of reminds me of the Simon and Garfunkel song, "The Sound of Silence." And what does it say in the song? There's a part of the song where he says, what the hell was it? The words of the prophets are written on the subway walls and in tenement halls. Isn't that beautiful? Absolutely beautiful. So, very much, when you think about it, it's like an Old Testament prophet. So, thus, the union serves both as a present instrument of struggle and as a preparation, like muscle strengthening itself for a greater exertion yet to come. De facto translation, in fact. Yet we examine the condition of our time with any seriousness, we see at once that the body within which labour must organise has grown beyond its former limits. Capital has slipped its national skin as a snake sheds its husk. Enterprises stretch across continents like veins that ignore the boundaries of organs. Markets are interlinked like nerves carrying sensation from different extremities, and goods of finance move with the indifference of blood that does not ask which limb it feeds. The worker in Auckland feels the pressure of decisions made in London, New York, or Shanghai as surely as a toe feels the consequence of a blow struck at the head. The miner, the seaman, the factory hand, and the clerk are all caught within a web as intricate as the small intestine, winding, inescapable, global in extent, sine qua non. Translation, without which not. To oppose such a system with purely local or national organisation is to attempt surgery with blunt instruments scattered across the floor. Matua Rudolf Rocker himself recognised the international character of the labour question. He saw that the interests of workers in different countries were aligned as closely as the organs within a single body, each dependent upon the other for life. The divisions imposed by nationalism he regarded as irritations of the skin, rashes deliberately inflamed to distract from the deeper melody of economic exploitation. Matua Rocker once said, quote, "Nationalism is the religion of the modern state." End of quote. Nationalism was not, in his estimation, a natural expression of human association. I would argue that that's actually tribalism, not nationalism. Tribalism is the natural expression, of human association, but we can get into that another time. So, but a political contrivance, a kind of fever that turns the body against itself. It fostered suspicion where there should be fellowship, and conflict where there should be cooperation. Much as an autoimmune disorder causes the blood to attack its own tissues. Dividere et impera. Translation, divide and rule. Who said that? Marcus Aurelius. Thus, the development of a global movement of labour unions is no foreign graft upon his thought, but a natural extension like the growth of a limb from a sound joint. Such a movement would embody solidarity on a scale equal to the forces it must confront. It would unite workers across borders as the bloodstream unites the body, enabling concerted action against the power of transnational capital, where a corporation shifts production to regions of lower wages. A global union could answer with coordinated action, preventing one group of workers from being used to undercut another, much as the body prevents one organ from draining the vitality of the rest without consequence. Mutatis mutandis. Translation, changing what must be changed. Where governments enact measures harmful to labour, international support would stiffen resistance like the tightening of muscle around a threatened bone. In this way, the isolation that has so often left workers exposed like flesh without skin would be replaced by a network of mutual support. Moreover, such a global movement would cultivate a broader consciousness among workers, enlarging their sense of themselves, really, when you think about it, sort of like we're part of this sort of interconnected web, if you will. They would come to see that they are not merely members of a trade or citizens of a nation, but participants in a shared human endeavour, parts of a single living organism. And when you think about it, like with the Kardashev scale, Nikolai Kardashev, right, and Michio Kaku, for example, talks about this. Well, I would argue that a global labour movement is vital to the creation of the so-called Type 1 civilization that certain physicists and so on and so forth like to talk about. That's what I would argue. So, Martha Rocker once said, quote, freedom can only exist when it is practiced by all, end of quote. This expansion of perspective is essential if the ideals of freedom and equality are to take root, for, as Martha Rudolph Rocker insisted, the struggle for emancipation is not merely material, but cultural and ethical, a matter of the mind, the heart, and the habits that bind them. Mens sana in corpore sano. Translation, a healthy mind and a healthy body. It involves the growth of new forms of association, new patterns of thought, and a renewed sense of responsibility towards others as vital as the proper function of the lungs or the steady beat of a heart. And considering the practical formation of where the hell are we? Of such a movement, it is necessary to adhere to the principles that Martha Rudolph Rocker held dear. This is obvious, so the chief among these is the rejection of centralized authority. A global labour movement must not become a rigid skeleton that locks the body into immobility, reproducing on a grand scale the very structures it seeks to overcome. Instead, it should consist of federations of unions joined by voluntary agreement and mutual respect, like joints that allow movement rather than prevent it. When you think about it, decentralized structures are much more resilient than centralized ones. You see what I'm saying? So that's just what history shows us. So, consensus facit legem. Translation, consent makes the law. Decisions must arise from the deliberation of those directly affected as impulses arise from living nerves rather than being imposed from above like commands barked from a distant brain that has forgotten the limbs it governs. Another principle of great importance is that of direct action. I think this is the most sort of important part that we've sort of forgotten. Matua Rocca once said, quote, "Direct action is the self-assertion of the worker in the face of all authority," end of quote. Matua Rudolf Rocca emphasized that workers must rely upon their own strength, not placing their hopes in political representatives or legislative remedies which so often prove as ineffective as a tonic applied to a mortal wound. Direct action encompasses a wide range of activities, from striking and boycotts to the creation of alternative forms of organization, each an exertion of the body's own force. Acta non verba, translation, actions, not words. A global movement of labor unions would magnify this power, allowing such actions to be carried out on a scale that cannot be ignored. Like the coordinated movement of many muscles acting together, it would demonstrate in practice the capacity of workers to govern their own affairs without recourse to external authority. It must also be admitted with a certain dry amusement that the path towards such a movement is not strewn with roses, unless one counts the thorns that pierce the foot at every step. The forces that profit from the present order are not inclined to surrender their advantages with a polite blow. Now, for those of you that might think I'm being a little bit paranoid, let me mention the example of Dr. Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was put in a lot of danger throughout his life when he was fighting racists, and yet, towards the end of his life, he dedicated himself to class issues, to workers' causes. It was always there, but it went on steroids towards the end of his life. That was when he died. I don't think that's a coincidence. They will employ legal restrictions, economic pressures, and ideological campaigns, all manner of devices to divide and discourage workers, such as much as a body under strain may suffer cramps, fevers, and other inconveniences that suggest it ought to lie down and give up. Homo homini lupus, translation, man is a wolf to man. National rivalries will be inflamed, cultural differences exaggerated, Judeo-Christian values, Islam, all this crap that you hear. Fear is carefully cultivated, as if one could persuade the left hand to distrust the right. In facing these challenges, the insights of Matua Rudolf Rocca remain of great value, for he understood that the struggle for freedom demands not only organization but perseverance, courage, and a stubborn adherence to principle. Matua Rocca once said, quote, "The will to freedom is stronger than all chains," end of quote. Education plays a vital role in this process. As essential as the proper functioning of the brain, workers must be furnished with the knowledge necessary to understand the conditions under which they live and the possibilities that lie before them. This education is not confined to formal instruction, but arises from the experiences of collective action itself, from participation in unions and discussions and in shared endeavors. Docendo discimus, translation, by teaching we learn. Through such engagement, individuals come to recognize their own strength. Much as a limb discovers its power through use, and to appreciate the necessity of solidarity, a global movement of labor unions would provide a rich field for such learning, bringing together diverse experiences and perspectives like nutrients gathered for many sources to sustain the body. because apparently, diverse diet is a good thing, omnivore and everything. And reflecting upon the legacy of Matua Rudolph Rocker, one is reminded that the struggle for a just society cannot be separated from the means by which it is pursued. The methods adopted must embody the values sought, as the health of the body depends upon the harmony of its parts. Matua Rocker once said, quote, "Means and ends are inseparable. A movement that aspires to freedom must itself be grounded in freedom. A movement that seeks equality must practice equality, and a movement that calls for solidarity must cultivate solidarity within its own ranks, lest it resemble a body that preaches balance while limping badly on one leg. Fiat Justitia Ruat Caelum. Translation: Let justice be done, though the heavens fall. The formation of a global network of labour unions along these lines would mark a significant step towards the realisation of these ideals. The urgency of this task presses upon us like a tightening in the chest. The conditions faced by workers in many parts of the world are harsh and, in some instances, worsening. Wealth continues to accumulate in ever fewer hands, like fat gathering around the organs. While insecurity of employment spreads like a wasting illness. And I think that's an important thing. Warren Buffett, the so-called, what's it called again, the seer of Oklahoma or whatever, I can't remember. But basically, he talked about how no one could have predicted the current economic situation we find ourselves in. He was sitting there in an interview. No one could have predicted the economic situation that we're in. He said that right in an interview. And yet, it's like, well, for someone who spends 6 hours a day supposedly reading, I'm surprised that you didn't read a book called Das Kapital, by Matua Karl Marx, who predicted exactly the kind of world that we would end up with, of a small few holding all of the wealth that is produced and it being concentrated into the small few. One of those small few, I might add, being Warren Buffett himself. Isn't that amazing? And yet, according to him, no one could have predicted this world. No one. Isn't that amazing? So, the formation, again, we already did this. So, the urgency of this task presses upon us like a tightening in the chest. The conditions faced by workers in many parts of the world are harsh. Yeah, I already did that, blah, blah, blah. So, technological advances, though capable of easing labour, are often employed in ways that intensify exploitation, as if one used a finely crafted instrument to deepen rather than heal a wound. Caveat emptor, translation, let the buyer beware. That was actually something Matua Michael Parenti talked about in his work. Rest in peace. Peace be upon him. Assalamu alaikum. He talked about how technology is not neutral, contrary to what people might think. It is for elite purposes. That is the technology that gets developed. And so, that's the point that I'm making here in the essay. So, environmental degradation too threatens livelihoods, poisoning the very ground upon which life depends. These issues are interconnected, forming a system as complex as the human body, and they require responses of equal scope. It is not enough to lament the injustices of the present order, though lamentation is a pastime at which many excel with admirable persistence, nor is it sufficient to place faith in distant reforms that may or may not arrive, like a promised cure that never reaches the patient. Matua Rocker once said, quote, "The future will be built by those who dare to act." End of quote. The transformation of society demands the active participation of those most affected by its failings, workers, in organising themselves across borders, may become the agents of this transformation of society. Demands so workers, challenging the structures of power that constrain them and laying the groundwork for a more equitable and humane world. Much as a body heals itself when its natural processes are allowed to function, per aspera ad astra, translation, through hardships to the stars. In conclusion, the call for a global movement of labor unions is deeply rooted in the ideas of Martin Rudolph Rocker. It arises from his understanding of power, his faith in the capacity of workers to organize themselves, and his commitment to freedom, equality, and solidarity. In an age marked by the globalization of capital, such a movement is not merely desirable but necessary, as necessary as the circulation of blood or the breath in the lungs. It continues a long tradition of struggle adapted to present conditions. Through it, the working classes of all lands may come to recognize their shared interests, act together, and shape their own destiny, not as scattered fragments, but as a living body, aware at last of its own strength. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.